Hey guys, so last week, get this out of here. Okay, last week we read about the Middle Ages. That was our introduction. And remember, the Middle Ages refers to a time period that existed in Western Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire. Now, they also call it the Middle Ages because it was like 1,000 year stretch that was between the ancient times and modern times. So it's kind of like the middle child there. Now, during the Middle Ages, if we can remember, King Charles, or they called him Charlemagne, he introduced the concept of feudalism. Now, feudalism, if you remember, it had the king, the nobles. Let me see if it's up here. Let's see. Well, anyway, the feudalism, here we go. The feudalism had the king, the nobles, the middle class, and the freedmen and serfs. Now, this was kind of like what you would refer to as a picking order in a way. It's a hierarchy. The king is on top who has the most power, but he also has to protect everyone underneath him. Whereas the individuals that are underneath him are very loyal to him. And they're very loyal to whoever is on top, like as far as classes go, on top of them. Now, the church during the Middle Ages became very important to people with the spread of Christianity, which Christianity, remember, is the lessons that was taught by Jesus Christ. His followers were known as Christians. And this religion was adopted by most of Europe. They went from a, a polytheistic religion to a monotheistic. And this became very big in Europe. And the church began to provide stability and hope during a difficult time. And over time, the church actually grew rich and powerful. And some of the people in charge did not like this because they held so much power. Now, so what we're going to do is we are going to be reading a story, chapter 2, that's entitled To the Manor Born. And here are the vocabulary words that we're going to need to know: Lord, which is a noun, and it is lowercased. It refers to a man in the upper class who ruled a large area of land. Lady is a female member of nobility. Privileged is having more advantages, opportunities, or rights than most people. Rival is competing. Loyal, showing complete faithfulness and support. And seethe is a farming tool with a curved blade with a long handle that's used to cut crops such as wheat, oats, rye, and barley. Now, we're going to go over to the story. Hopefully, there we go. Now, the big question, and you are going to have to answer this big question later on this week. I do not know why this keeps popping up. The big question is, how were the lives of serfs and lords different from one another? How are the lives of serfs and lords different from one another? Now, as we read, we may come across some unfamiliar words. Now, remember, there are some ways that we can identify these unfamiliar words. We can use the glossary that I gave you, or we could also use context clues, the texts that are surrounding them. So, let's get started. To the manor born. If you lived during the Middle Ages, your life followed one of a few set paths. If you were a child of a king or queen, or a lord or lady, you lived a privileged life. You had enough food to eat and clothes to wear. You lived in a relatively nice house. You had servants, too. You may have been one of the few who learned to read and write. You even learned to ride a horse. If you were a boy, you learned to become a skilled swordsman. Privileged girls may have learned to embroider, to dance, and to play an instrument. Occasionally, girls too learned to read. As a privileged child, you likely grew up to become a king or queen or a lord or lady yourself. So look at this. Look at the picture. This is a picture of a privileged family in the Middle Ages. As you can see, they live in a nice home, which you could see. They're nicely dressed, they're wearing colorful clothing. And if you look in the background, they live in a brick or a stone home. They have dishes, they have cabinets. That is some of the identifiers of a privileged family. Now, what are some things that the privileged children got to do that the other children didn't get to do? Well, the first and foremost, they had enough food to eat. The unprivileged children went day by day just hoping to get a morsel of food. They had clothes to wear that didn't have holes or tears or anything in them. They had people to help them do their things. They had servants. The boys learned to read and write, and if you were lucky as a girl, you learned to read. Because back then, girls weren't expected to do much. As you can see, they just learned how to embroider, dance, and play a musical instrument. But most of the kids that were privileged grew up to be either a king or queen or a lord or lady themselves. But most people in the Middle Ages were not privileged. In the early Middle Ages, nearly everyone in Europe worked on the land. Most farmers were called serfs. Serfs grew the food and tended to the livestock or animals that fed the people. Some had more freedom than others and were called freedmen. Serfs were on the bottom of the social order and had the least amount of power. So, what does the author tell us the main responsibility of a serf was? Well, the main responsibility of a serf was to grow food and tend to the animals. That was their food source. And were most people during the Middle Ages, were they mostly privileged or were they mostly unprivileged like the serfs? Well, if you look at the first sentence, it says, but most people in the Middle Ages were not privileged. So they were mostly in the lower part of the hierarchy chart. All right, so we have some right here. Serfs usually spent their entire lives working on a landowner's or lord's estate. In return for the work they did, the lord allowed serfs to use some of the land to grow their own food. The lord lived in this castle or manor house. He owned all the land around his home and often in the nearby villages too. The lords also controlled the lives of most people that worked for him. So if you can look at the image, you can see that this is what the serfs did throughout the year. So we're going to start in the top left-hand corner. It looks like I really don't see what that guy's doing. Let me look. Oh, he is harvesting. He has a sift in his hand, and he's harvesting the oats, grain, or whatever. And it looks like next to him, he's either picking up something or digging. Looks like they are cutting some stuff. They are tending to the sheep or even cutting the wool. They may be breaking the horse, sieving right here. There's another harvesting. They're harvesting right here. They're sowing the ground. They could be squishing the grapes for wine. I really don't know what he's doing. And then they could be doing something with the animals. So, serfs were not educated. They did not learn to read or write. If serfs wanted to travel to a nearby town, they needed permission from the lord. When the serfs wanted to marry, the lord had the right to approve or disapprove of the match. That means the lord could say yes or no if you were allowed to marry that person. When serfs had children, those children usually grew up to work as serfs for that very same lord or the children of the lord. Now, looking back, what was another name for a castle? It said some of the lords lived in castles or they were called Manors. Very good. Manor, like a manor, Manor. So they're just basically bigger homes. So if you were to just go off what we read, do you think you would want to be a lord or a serf? And why? That's something you need to think about in your head. So let's move on to the next page. In the Middle Ages, serfs worked on farmlands that were divided into strips. The serfs spent about half of their time working for the Lord, and the rest of the time they worked on on the strip of land where they owned crops, where their own crops grew. I can't read that sentence. Most serfs lived in small, simple houses in or near the village. Their houses were made from wood and mud. The roofs were thatched, meaning they were made of rushes of straw. They usually had just one room. Serfs slept on straw beds. Inside each house was a small fireplace for cooking. Smoke from the fire escaped through holes in the roof. Would you describe the way that a serf lived as a nice life or not, in your opinion? Think about that. The Lord increased his wealth in many different ways. In addition to working the farmland for the Lord, serfs paid taxes to the Lord in the form of money, crops, and livestock. Sometimes the Lord ran a mill and even charged the serfs a fee to grind their grain for flour. If crops failed or illness struck, people during the Middle Ages struggled to survive. In the time of hardship, the Lord did not always come. I'm going to read the rest of this sentence and then we'll go back to the aid of his serfs. Even when food supply were low, serfs were not allowed to hunt in the Lord's forest. However, to avoid starving, people sometimes hunted illegally. This is called poaching, and the serfs who were caught poaching were severely punished. So we're going to go back up here, and this would be an image of what the like an area where a serf would work. You had the manor or the castle that was up here. You had a church, and then you had the serfs' accommodations or homes right there. Now, how did the Lord become even richer? Not just by, getting what the serfs grew, but what else did he do? Well, he taxed in form of money, crops, or livestock, and he even charged them to use the mill, which ground the wheat and whatever they needed into a flour or something that they could use to cook. So, even when there wasn't enough food, the Lord did not help them. They had to resort to poaching, and if poachers were caught, they were severely punished. Some farm workers were freedmen. Freedmen were not under the same strict control of the Lord. If a serf ran away from his home and managed to live for a year and a day in a town without being found, he would be a freed man too. In the Middle Ages was a violent compared to how we live today. There were frequent wars and uprisings, including rebellions against the king by rival nobles. The need to arm protection shaped medieval society. Usually, high ranking nobles swore their loyalty to the king and the lords, swore their loyalty to high ranking nobles. Freedmen and serfs had to be loyal to the lords. In exchange for their loyalty, the lord offered his protection. If the lord needed to raise an army, he would require freedmen on his estate to serve as foot soldiers. So, number one, from this page, remember there was no poaching. It was bad. Now, why was the medieval society organized for war? Why did they organize war? Well, because, like I said earlier, they were rival noblemen, and the more land they had, the more rich they could get. So they were always ready to defend their area. Now, who were required to fight if the lord of the manor required it? Well, you had your freedmen. And the serfs could be needed to work for them, but the freedmen were the ones that served them. Okay. So look at this. And on this picture, we have the like someone farming. Like that would be considered like their personal land. You have a water mill. This would where your mill would be, where they grounded everything. Someone over here with the animals, and someone uh, getting the field ready to sow the crops. If you were a boy serf, from an early age, you worked a full day. You woke up just before sunrise and go to sleep when it is dark. For breakfast, you have rye bread and water, or perhaps watery ale. Even before the sun is fully risen, and regardless of the weather, you begin your work on the land. In springtime, you are busy plowing and planting seeds. You assist the delivery of a baby lambs and calves. At midday, you walk home for a simple meal of rye bread and maybe a small piece of cheese. After lunch, you return to work, cutting logs for the Lord's fire. In the summer months, you tend to the crops you planted in the spring. You keep the hungry birds and insects away from the growing crops. Autumn is a time for harvesting to harvest crops. It's perhaps the busiest time of year. You help your mother and sisters pick fruits and berries, which they preserve and store for the winter. Now, so as you can see, this is just an image of what you would do. Using a simple tool called a sieve, you harvest grain such as crops such as wheat, oats, rye, and barley. You help store the grain as you help store the grain. A good harvest makes everyone, especially the Lord, very happy. It means there's food to eat during the winter months. A good harvest is time of celebration for all. Nevertheless, you have to get used to having less food to eat in the wintertime, and to feeling hungry and cold more often than not. At times, your parents find it difficult to make ends meet. Even if the ice and snow lay upon the frozen earth, you still have jobs to do. You have to feed and care for the livestock, you have to repair the fences and the barns, all while you continue to work on your family strip of land. Each evening, when the sun is setting, you return home quite exhausted, and you end your day with a meal called porridge, and your mothers and sisters have prepared. Porridge is a vegetable stew with grain and tiny bits of meat or fish in it. After a good night's sleep, you will wake up and do it all over again. So, how would the serf's jobs differ from the seasons compared to, let's start with the winter months to the spring to fall? I skipped summer. The winter, the spring, the summer, and the fall. Like, how would they differ? Well, in the wintertime, you're mending the fences, you're keeping the livestock alive. The springtime, you're getting ready, the fields ready, and you're sowing the crops. And then you're also trying to keep all the birds and the annoying things away. Summertime, you're making sure everything is nice, and then the harvest comes around in the fall. So you had a pretty busy day, all in all. Now, so that is this story of To the Manor Born. So if you don't mind, if you would read this to an adult, read it out loud or read it to yourself. And as you're reading, please pay attention to the question of how were the lives of serfs and lords different from one another? All right, guys, that is your story, chapter 2. We will get back at it here in a little bit. Have a good day.